Hello everyone. We've been having some issues because I know that Robin doesn't have internet where they are, and we have to make sure that they can that he can still get on with phone and stuff like that. But I mean, hi. You're watching IndiE3 2014. My name is Lonnie Stewart. I'm going to just start right now. This is the panel on game music and music games. I have Liz Ryerson with me again. She was on the last panel. Henk Boom.
Hey.
Henk Boom. Isaac Schankler.
Hello.
And Robert Arnott.
Hi.
Yes, and I'm just going to let them go. I'm going to let them go for an hour, and I'm going to be back here listening. I'll probably be back around the 55 to make sure that we can do that for the next panel, but yeah. Thanks for watching, everyone.
Awesome.
I love that interference sound, just by the way.
Which one of you?
Amazing.
Which one of you is Solon
something
cubed?
is definitely happening.
Is one of you Solon cubed?
No, I don't know where he is.
Yeah, I see Solon cubed in the channel, although
I think that's where the feedback's coming from.
But I think Solon cubed is supposed to be recording though, so I think there's some issues, particularly.
I see.
So, what you should do is that you should all mute Solon cube.
Yeah, I
so
locally
you don't
muted
hear.
him, so I don't
Yeah,
hear
okay.
it.
Yeah, so you should do a local mute just to make sure. And then
I didn't realize I could do that.
Oh yeah,
Oh,
you
awesome.
do right click on it.
Oh, wonderful. Okay.
I have no right-click abilities.
Oh no.
Okay.
That's fine. I'll deal, guys.
Okay,
Alright.
that's totally okay. That's totally okay. We're happy we were able to do some magic and get you on anyways. So.
Yeah, yes. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here. So, I was telling everyone that I did not have a particular agenda for this discussion. It's just kind of like, you're all people whose work that I admire, and who do very unconventional things with sound and music and games. So, yeah, why don't we just go through and do introductions first, I guess, starting with whoever wants to start.
I can start. I'm making a game called Sound Self right now. It's a trance experience that uses sound and the feeling of your voice to sort of hack your perception of self. It's sort of like, the experience itself is sort of like the Star Child sequence in 2001, but interactive and an hour long. And that's what I'm working on.
Okay, I guess I'll go. I'm Liz Ryerson. I do like music for games. I did music for Dysphoria, for example. I don't know, some other games, Crypt Worlds. I do sound effects and music. I don't know. I don't have a particular agenda with sound, but it is I guess one thing that I do have opinions about or whatever. But yeah, I guess I'm working on sound effects for a project. What is it called? It's called Oh Dear. But anyway, yeah. Go ahead.
Hey, I'm Hank. I did the programming and the sound engine for Fract OSC. So it's a game about synthesizers, which released like a month ago. So just sort of coming off of that. I guess I also have some opinions about audio in games.
Excellent.
Hank, you also are on the credits of every obscure game that I love.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, great. And I'm Isaac. So I did music and sound for some games, including Analog Hate Story and Depression Quest and Red Shirt. And I also have kind of a double life as, I guess, an academic who writes concert music and experimental music. So negotiating between those two has been fun and interesting, yeah. So yeah, I'll start out with that kind of general vague question of the fact that everyone is doing something unconventional with sound, and there's this kind of accepted language of sound and music in video games that I think borrows maybe a lot from cinematic language.
Yeah, I agree.
And what I like about what everyone here is doing is that it's very much not that. So if your influences aren't aren't the language of movies or these kind of pre-existing modes of how to use sound in music and games. What are your inspirations? Where does it come from? Or did you just make it up out of thin air?
It's funny you bring up the sound history in film, right? Because I personally came from a film base, and my early work, thankfully nobody heard, was very much that space you described, not doing it particularly well. So I think my work started to get really interesting as I started pulling from inspirations well outside of film, and for me, my current major inspirations are just singing bowls. I'm sure you're all familiar with Tibetan bowls.
Yes.
Yep.
So, and for
But I think
anybody who
maybe
doesn't
for
know
the
what these are,
audience,
they're just this wonderful magic instrument that you rub a little friction against the edges, and they sing. They make this beautiful tone, but it's not. What's not amazing about them, I think, is how they sound. I don't think it's how they sound that makes them really special, but there's these really weird phase relationships between the different resonating parts of the bowl, and as they hit your ear at different times as well, the sound does not feel like it originates from the bowl. It feels like it originates somewhere in your body, which is just a magical experience. And so those kinds of sound sources, also the feeling of creating sound and participating in an experience like a group ohm, which is where you are chanting with a whole lot of people and you sort of lose a sense of your own sound into the sound of everybody. It really breaks your perception of where sound is originating, and kind of messes with your perception of what you sound like and where your body ends, I suppose. And these have been my big inspirations that sort of catalyzed my current weirdo experiment.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned singing bowls, because I think one thing that's very unusual about them compared to most sounds is that they're a very complex set of pitches. So it's really hard to like different people will hear them completely differently, because they also, in the way that you're describing, kind of mess with perception in a particular way.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know that people will hear them differently, but of course that makes absolutely intuitive sense.
Yeah, like if you ask people like what is the main pitch of this bowl, different people will give completely different answers.
Oh my god, that's amazing! I had no idea. Is that based on phase relation and positioning, or is that based on like everyone's unique cochlea? Do you know anything about that?
I am not entirely sure, but it's kind of the fact that, for example, if you have a set of, this is getting super nerdy already, like this is if you have like a sound that's a set of pitches in a particular kind of like mathematical relationship called the harmonic series, you will tend to hear the one that's on the bottom as the main fundamental pitch. But because the singing bowls are more complex than that, there's kind of more ways. It's kind of actually similar to video games. I love that we're hearing this airplane sound here.
Yeah,
I can mute that.
Yeah.
No,
okay.
it's awesome.
It makes sense to have music playing throughout the whole.
Yeah, to have ambient sound.
Definitely.
But what's interesting about it, the sort of connection that I feel about it, is that there's a sense of sort of maybe agency or individuality that is similar to video games, where you're able to make choices about how you listen. Do you think that's an element as well?
With the singing bowls?
Well, with the singing bowls being the inspiration for Sound Self, for example.
Oh, well, so I'm kind of trying to purge choice from the video game experience. So at least active choice, conscious choice. So I guess I'd have to say no. That is super interesting about singing bowls that I hadn't really thought of.
But I mean, there's the sense that everyone is going to have a different experience with Sound Self, right?
Right, absolutely.
Yeah. And it's just
I guess
one-on-one
where
thing.
I should be. So the word choice to me implies when you say agency, to me that implies like I'm thinking about something and making a decision, and I'm deliberately expressing myself through that decision. Whereas what I'm trying to explore is trying to sort of silence that part of yourself that is thinking.
Yeah.
Just let the part of yourself that's feeling really dominate. Yeah, so I really hope everybody will have a really unique listening experience to it, but I don't think it's about making decisions per se.
Yeah. Can I ask that same question to Liz and Hank? Because there's kind of that, because I think it's relevant to what they do as well.
Which question?
Oh, well, just the fact that, well, I want to ask if agency is important to the work that you do.
Yeah. So I guess I'll go next. That's really interesting because I think agency is a word that we use to mean a lot of different things in games. So for me, I think what's really important in the sound is how it helps the person sort of understand where they are, what they're doing. So for me, it's kind of another aspect of game feel, along with like how the controls feel, what they're seeing. Yeah, so I mean, if it doesn't inform their agency or doesn't inform sort of what they're doing, then I guess I feel like I'm not doing the right thing.
Yeah. I guess like that is also part of my perspective. I think like with sound you can sort of create this whole implied emotional world to something that you can't do with anything else. Like you can sort of do that with visuals, but it doesn't like go directly into your like veins, you know, or however you want to describe it. Like there's something about music or sound that is just like so direct and immediate. So like, you know, if you want to elicit emotional response from somebody, instead of like typing text on the screen like I'm depressed or whatever, which I feel like I've seen a lot of games you could like play a song, and you know, like that, you know, people are very sensitive to music and very sensitive to sound, and even if they don't consciously think that like, you know, consciously know how to interpret it, it will have like an effect on them, a pretty like serious one.
If I could jump in on that, Liz.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think so. Sorry, this feedback's driving me crazy. Yeah, I think. So I've spent a lot of time like thinking about what you're describing about how sound has a way of passing whatever parts of the mind are used for critically analyzing something before deciding whether to let it in or not, right? And I really think like we're such visual creatures. Humans are. We take in all this visual data and analyze it, and we make decisions based on that. But we process sound in a completely different way, and you kind of have to be trained to even be able to listen to sound in a critical way at all, right? Like we can all have a critical relationship with what we're seeing, but you have to have, I think, some level of training and a much greater level of deliberate attention to have that same critical relationship with sound. And I think the result of that is that you don't have an opportunity to mentally deny it. You don't have an opportunity to think about it and think about, oh yeah, might be making me feeling this way because of this tonal structure or whatever, right? It just does what it's going to do to your brain.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point.
I was saying, so I probably have a lot less musical training than anybody else in this group, and I'd be curious to hear how your musical training, and as you are more able to critically comprehend and parse into thoughts music you listen to, I'm curious to hear how that has affected your music listening experiences.
Go ahead, Hank.
Sorry?
Yeah, just go.
Yeah, so I don't actually have very much musical training at all, other than some, I guess I definitely had some like piano lessons as a kid, but it never really got as far as music theory. So, I mean, when I'm listening to music, recently I've been kind of chasing music that gives me a sort of sense of some kind of texture, some kind of feeling that I don't really understand. And the fact that I don't understand it, but there feels like a hint of understanding there, that's something I could try and find, is really important to me. That and sort of like the mood that is induced kind of by the texture of the sound.
Can you go into more detail about what you mean by texture?
So kind of like looking at sounds not as notes, but as sounds. So there still might be like melodic relationships. There still might be like rhythmic relationships, but they're kind of abstracted enough from things that you hear a lot that you're kind of forced to look at them as texture. So I mean, I guess like a lot of sort of like post-rock sounds also kind of focus on that issue of texture, but I think there's a huge world of other kinds of textures outside of like a few set instruments that is really interesting to explore for different things.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting. I also kind of want to answer Robin's question, since I'm probably the most overeducated person here. I guess the answer is I don't know, because I don't, having arguably too much musical training, it definitely changes. I know it changes the way that I listen and the way I process sound. But I don't really know, because I can't really go back and get into a state where...
Isaac, can you...
Yeah? Hello?
Like, listen to and enjoy Rihanna?
Yeah, absolutely. But maybe it is hard to... And I think maybe this is true with anyone who works with sound. There is kind of like an automatic kind of like critical apparatus that kind of like activates, and you stop sort of absorbing it, and you start trying to take it apart and being like, how would I recreate this, as you're listening. And that is definitely a different mode of listening, and it's not something that everyone will automatically do, but a lot of times. But okay, what I will say is that a lot of times I do try and do maybe what Sound Self does, and what different kinds of other kind of meditative experiences, especially meditative listening experiences, do, where you try and get into a state where you're not engaged with it critically. And for example, like the music of Morton Feldman, I think, is really, really good at getting you into that state. I mean, you have to sort of invest the time into it, because often his pieces are very, very long, and it's not until like, maybe like half an hour into the piece where you finally get into that state where you're actually listening to just what's happening, rather than kind of placing your own kind of framework on it. But it takes a certain amount of investment to do that. But I also want to go back and talk about, that idea that music accesses this kind of like, kind of like short circuits you to this place that visuals don't necessarily automatically do. And I kind of want to say that the opposite is also true. I don't know if anyone else has had this experience in creating music for games, but having created music for games and having, creating music outside that context, what I found is that putting just the act of putting music in a game, the act of putting it into a game, all of a sudden creates this kind of complex of emotional attachment, and people relate to it in an incredibly different way. And it might be, the exact same music. One example might be, I had no idea when I wrote for the music for Depression Quest, like what that music would do, like in the context of that game. I think if you heard that music on its own, you might be like, kind of like, oh, that's kind of pretty or whatever. But in the context of the game, it becomes incredibly oppressive, and almost to the point where I wish I'd found some way to make it less oppressive, but simply because it's in the context of this thing. So I think people think of music as this thing that adds this emotional element to games, where I think the inverse is sometimes true, where games can create this emotional attachment to the music.
That's
really
definitely
interesting.
true.
Yeah. What do you think? What do you think? I guess in the case of Direction Quest, what do you think made that difference? Sorry, that's I guess kind of a hard question.
It is kind of a hard question. I've thought about that a lot. I mean, I think it's just, you know, when you put these kind of media together, it becomes more than the sum of its parts. I think that's a big part of it.
Can I say something on this topic?
Yes, please.
Okay, so I used to be on this website called OCRemix, .ocremix.org, and like that's partly how I got my start making music. And it was rearrangements of video game music, because like, you know, a lot of people that I know, or I mean I did this too, like put up a tape recorder to their speaker or something, and you get really these like extreme emotional attachments to music, and like, you know, so part of that is about sort of reliving that and re-experiencing that. So I definitely think if you look at just the popularity of game music and the kind of like those video games live concerts, that's why like that's why orchestras can, like, you know, stay with people in the seats and stuff, because tons of people come to these things. But one other thing I wanted to say is, just as far as background, is like I don't have like lots of formal education training. I guess the biggest thing is that I had I just listened to like tapes all the time when I was a kid. I had a tape player, and like I like would bring it to school until they like confiscated it, and I would just like listen to old like Beatles albums and stuff. And I was really into like some of the Stranger stuff. Like I really liked the song "I Am the Walrus" because it had all these like tape loops and things. And
yeah, that's by far my favorite of their work.
And I think that like kind of set the stage for me for a lot of things. Like for a while, I really wanted to make guitar music, because I thought it was more like real and all that stuff. But I realized sort of slowly that electronic music has this like huge breadth. Like you can make any kind of sounding thing, really. Like it's just a matter of what kind of sounds you find and, you know, what you put into it. And anyone can make that on their laptop, essentially, you know. And I think that's tremendously empowering for me. And yeah, I don't know. Anyway.
Yeah, I think that's really important.
I'd be really curious to hear a few of you, because we have a few people in this group now, and I think it's becoming more and more.
Robin, I think you're breaking up. Is that just me, or yeah?
Yeah, I heard.
Exploration. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'd be curious to hear how some of you have approached player-generated music. Breakup joke.
You should probably restart from like that whole 5 seconds, because I didn't hear any of that. That was just breakup.
Okay.
Yep.
I'd be really curious to hear how some of you have approached player-generated music, because I feel like as the interactive music tech is getting more advanced, and especially in Fract, right, where you really musically empower players, which is one of the totally beautiful things about it. I guess I'd be curious to hear some of your design imperatives going into that, Hank.
Yeah. So I mean, in case anyone doesn't know, like a big part of Fract is you're sort of wandering around this world, solving these different kinds of puzzles, but everything in it is sort of geared to teaching you to eventually make your own sound and make your own music. So what it really seemed over the course of development was that the best way to you can always just give someone like a creative tool and like ask them to do something with it, but it's kind of like this like blank page syndrome where they're not going to really know what to do, and they're going to be kind of afraid of doing things and making mistakes. So what we really had to do was, through the different puzzles that we had in the game, or through the different like little interactive bits in the game, kind of trick the player into doing these things by accident. So by the time we actually ask them to make, like, to compose a little bit of music or something like that, we've kind of given them the opportunity to explore it a bit, almost like as a side effect of other things that they were doing.
Yeah, they've been
I
sort
think-
of incidental
yeah.
making music all along.
Yeah, exactly. Like we almost needed to kind of get people over that sort of like initial hump by just kind of like tricking them into not realizing they were doing it.
But the game also has like a studio thing on its own too, right?
Yeah, exactly. So the idea is that, like, as you're going through the world, you're kind of doing these different things, you're using these different tools, and by the time you actually get to the studio, the vast majority of the tools that are in there have been shown to you in some form or another already. So it's kind of just like, oh, I can sort of play with combining these things in different ways instead of having to start from scratch a little bit.
One thing I wanted to ask about that is because first of all, well, I loved Fract, and I sort of like raced through the game. I think I finished it in a day, maybe two, and I wondered if you had a sense of like people who are playing it, what like non-musicians versus musicians, like how fast they progress through the game, and if they were more likely to get stuck, because like everything was very like immediately apparent to me, because because it kind of depends on this language of synthesizers and other kinds of audio software that that I'm familiar with. But I wondered if you had a sense of like how, and it, to me it seems like you do a great job of introducing those things one at a time, but I wondered if you had a sense of like how how different kinds of players relate to that.
Yeah. So it's hard to have like a really accurate picture of how people you don't know are experiencing the game. But just from seeing what kind of stuff people have uploaded to YouTube, like kind of music that they're making, I mean, we're definitely getting people who have like never made music before, never tried any of this stuff, just going in and like trying things, and it's really refreshing because in some sense you can kind of see like in their music what kind of like parts of the game they were influenced by, or what kind of like mechanics in the game that are resulting in that kind of music. Because for example, like in our in the way that we use sequence notes in a bar, it's kind of like a grid step sequencer, but you, instead of just clicking on each little square, it's very easy to just drag the cursor across it and just drag a whole streak of notes. And whether you do that on one synthesizer versus another will influence like whether multiple notes get put down on one row or on one at one time or not, for example. And you can literally hear in some of the music that it's like, yeah, people started by just kind of scribbling around and singing out at it. And it's really fun to kind of, it's really refreshing to see like, okay, this is actually something else music could sound like that we're not actually doing, just because this person who knew nothing about the music just tried making things and seeing what sounded good.
With the puzzles in the game, were you trying to guide people towards making certain kinds of sounds or structures, or because if for people who aren't familiar with it, there is this kind of step sequencer thing, and but you do have to you do have to make something happen, something specific happen to continue on to the next phase.
Right. So I mean, that's sort of a lot of stuff that Richard is in charge of, and like did a great job of it, I think. And it was really kind of built around like, because all of these instruments are playing in the same world, and as you go in the game, they get combined in different ways. We kind of had to make sure that the different things that the players created would all sound good together. So there is kind of a curatorial control layer over kind of what notes people are allowed to use, what sort of ranges the modulations fall into, and by restricting the solutions of the puzzles to like one of a few sort of in a vague area, we can kind of control what sorts of sounds are going to come out of that. And while like every two people will get something like slightly different depending on the puzzle, we did need to kind of exert that. So as you're like, one side effect of this is as you're working towards a proper solution, you do also kind of get this gradual change in the sound as it goes from kind of like discordant or slow or whatever, and it leads up to this one sort of like central climax. And you can, if you're paying attention to the music, you can actually kind of hear the way that all comes together. So yeah, I guess in response to like how are the puzzles designed, a lot of them were kind of designed with a certain sound as sort of the goal, and then sort of we kind of like determine the individual mechanics and determine the individual rules that they have to, or constraints they have to satisfy around sort of converging them towards that.
Yeah, I think we have a question in the chat window that I think is for you. Could you elaborate on how you kept such otherworldly aesthetics in the audio for the game as well as with the visuals?
So I guess I understand this. Like we have a very like abstract art style. It's very kind of like Tron-like or Res-like, and it's sort of this. Yeah, I guess otherworldly is a good word. So I think it just came from having like Richard had a pretty good idea of in general what the sound of the game should be like. I think he's hanging around in the chat if he wants to add something in. But yeah, I mean, the game was very much based on sort of 80s like synthesizer type sounds or sounds from electronic music at that time. And so we did have a kind of like framework within to work in terms of finding the right sounds. And I guess an important note on that is that the framework we were working within was not that of like kind of representational audio. I think that's the key, is kind of escaping like realism-oriented ways of looking at sound. Like
yeah, and that goes back to one of the original questions that Isaac asked, which is how the indie game space anyway is distinguishing itself from the film inspirations that are dominating AAA. What one particular sound choice you guys made in Frack that I love is the use of silence. The very, very, very silent, and not like quiet ambient background, but like actually pure silent game, except for the musical interactions, right? And that's not how games are quote unquote supposed to sound, right? You're supposed to have these footstep sound, and every space is supposed to sound different, and like people spend so much energy trying to fill in all the silence. And I think it's so bold how Frack, which is an extremely musical sonic game, is so silent for so much of it.
Yeah.
So I guess Richard added in a little bit in the chat, but there was a big gradient of like going from areas where there's no sound to going to areas where there's a lot of sound. And so even in there, in that contrast, there's a lot of sort of non-realistic things we do with the way that sounds can, or the way that sounds like get louder as you come close to them. Most of the cutoffs of all the sounds, sort of the maximum range at which you can hear things, is actually fairly short. And that allows us to put silence in a lot of the areas, whereas I guess in real life you would be hearing all these far off things. And in part that was due to technical constraints, but it also does lead to that sort of pacing of you're gradually ramping up and ramping down, and yeah, as Richard mentions, we removed a lot of sound over the course game at the same time as we were adding sound. Yeah.
I think it's like really important, at least for me, that like we throw all existing rules about how sound effects and sound work in games out the window and like reevaluate for particular projects. So it's always interesting when people are trying like new things to me, because like there are all these implicit assumptions.
I couldn't agree with you more, Liz. I totally couldn't agree with you more. And it's so interesting, the assumptions that you might be making that you might not even realize you were making, right?
Yeah, like, I don't know, just, you know, like the footsteps thing, like, why do you need to have footsteps in your game? There's absolutely no reason. And it goes back to the thing where it's, like, representational audio versus, like, or being representational versus just having an emotional effect or being abstract. And, like, video games are inherently abstract. They don't achieve representationality, like, very well, so... So it makes sense to do something more abstract, both from a limitation perspective and that, you know, it's the character of the sound of the game.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, in fact, right? It's ostensibly a first-person game, but there's no reason to assume that the person thing that you are occupying even has feet, right? You're a floating window into this abstract world.
Yeah, we actually spent a while playing around with different kinds of like footstep noises, in fact, and like we were kind of going along that track of like, well, maybe if we abstract them, maybe if we kind of like accomplish a similar thing with something that you already did music, and yeah, eventually we just decided it's like, no, we have more important uses for this audio.
I imagine
The
it would be really
footsteps we're not doing it.
oppressive and really to have a constant footstep. I mean, that would. I can't imagine that would work the way you want it to.
In fact, I think that's even an effect sometimes used specifically in cinema, where it's like you cut out all sound and just have that little bit of like footsteps, or if anything, and it does accomplish kind of a specific thing that might not be what you're intending.
Yeah. Yeah, even like,
really,
yeah. Go ahead.
I just really like what you bring up about video games being inherently abstract, and you're right. I hadn't thought about that before. Like, it's true. You have to work. Whereas film as a medium is inherently representational, right? I mean, unless you remove the lens entirely.
I would still argue that film is abstract because it's like the way that it's presented is abstracted, but not as much.
Can you explain what you mean?
Well, like editing, like the way that you frame time in film is completely different. Like, and I don't know, like the ways that sound work, it's still like kind of a canvas to me, and like canvas is being defined by like a camera and you know all that other stuff. But like now with like digital film, like or you know digital editing, like you can do almost anything. Like you know one example that I think of is the David Lynch movie Inland Empire, which was done with like Sony PD 150 like consumer level cameras, and like there's so much like weird filtering and stuff that you could not do to film. It almost becomes kind of like this weird sort of painting that is using film as you know a basis.
But the difference is with film, as long as you've got a lens, right, you're still taking something that actually exists out there, and representing it, and representing it, right. Whereas in games, as in canvassed art, right, you're there. The things you're creating have no out there existence unless you import them directly by another means like photography or sound recording. I think
games.
And so there's, sorry.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No. So there was just this like intrinsically abstract nature that I would go as far as to say the industry as a whole has kind of working really hard and sometimes doing a really good job to move away from, but in the indie sphere, but I've seen so many games that really embrace that limitation. Yeah. And especially the limitations of an inherently abstract form. You get this really interesting dance between what is abstract and what is and I think there's almost a necessary minimalism in choosing where one does represent or be representative.
Yeah, and the choices come from like the specific things that you want to do with like the specific game, like the kind of emotional effects that you want it to have on people, or the you know the idea behind it. But yeah, I think games are inherently like weaker when they try to be purely representational. I don't think it's like a good thing to like. It costs so much money, so many resources are poured into making them representational. But like it doesn't necessarily add anything beyond like being this kind of escape kind of spectacle thing. I really think that like games are inherently like more effective at this like abstracted level.
And you know, like games as a medium are also, I mean, they're abstract, right? Or at least they begin abstract unless you add meaning and representation into them. But if there's one thing that really is almost universally true about games, whether they're goal-oriented or not, is, I mean, they're systems, right? They're operating mathematics. And the same thing is absolutely true of music, which is also an inherently abstract form that is also inherently mathematical.
Yeah,
it's really interesting. Sorry.
Well, I was going to say, I think one thing is that maybe there's this tendency towards greater and greater realism, at least in the big budget games, or representationalism, if you want to call it that, because I think there's this sense there's this idea that that's more powerful. It's more powerful if you approach reality. But what I find interesting is that people will kind of literally accept any reality if you put it in front of them, and it's so powerful just to have like audio and visuals together, just to have two sensations together is like kind of exponentially more powerful. And I think that's something that happens in all of your games. If you just think about, like you jump and then you land and it makes a sound, and it's this connection that your brain makes. Your brain makes this connection just by the fact that these two things are simultaneous. And they even though they can be completely decontextualized sounds, like I know, like Robin, your sound design for Antechamber kind of had all these kind of decontextualized sounds, but as you sort of progress through the game, you sort of get a feel for like the language of those sounds on their own terms. And I was also at an event earlier today where thunderstorms were created by giving you an umbrella and a set of headphones, and the set of headphones is having the sound of rain, but the sound of rain is also being sort of through a speaker kind of vibrating the handle of your umbrella. And just the fact of those two things together, like you're hearing it and you're feeling it through your hand at the same time, is like a million trillion times more effective than just the one sensation on its own. And even though it's like completely stylized, completely fake, it's California, it's sunny.
Yeah. It's funny because it makes you wonder how much the way we associate sounds with visuals in real life is actually based on proper understanding, and how much of it is actually based on just what things happen at the same time. Because it feels like
I need to note that you have about 5 minutes left. So if there's any concluding remarks you want to make, any questions you want to answer, you should probably do that as soon as possible.
Okay, Hank, go.
Okay, yeah. So one thing, I took a class in sound synthesis when I was at university, and one of the things that we were talking about is how a lot of sounds that we do hear and that we would recognize if we saw where they were coming from, if you listen to them without actually seeing the thing, you can't actually tell what they are. Like, it could be a whole variety of different things, and it's only when you see it with the visuals that it locks into one of those kind of possibilities. So I think, yeah, the way that we combine things is almost like just as important as the individual things that we're making.
There's a wonderful word for this from my absolute favorite sound design book called Audiovision by Shion.
That was actually the book that we read in that class.
Oh yeah, it's I used to just keep like multiple copies of it so I could give them away to sound designers and musicians, but it's out of print, so that just became kind of expensive. But yeah, the word is syncresis, which is a mashup of, I believe, synthesis and or synchronization and synthesis, where you take any sound, right, and just mash it up with any visual, and your brain will just make the connection. And you could mash up some really obscure relationships, and it takes something really extreme before your brain starts to notice something is up. We get away with that shit.
Yeah, it's true. I think one thing that I just wanted to add in general is I think, like, as far as, because Isaac was talking about this earlier, as far as making something feel believable, not maybe at a representational level, but at a, like, this is a real experience, I think sound, like, does it much more effectively than anything else I can think of. Like visuals do create that sense, but you can have a very abstract, very simple visual world, but the sound like really defines the experience for me anyway. I don't know.
Yeah, I definitely agree.
And it's
agree
very
too.
easy for us to agree with that because we're audio people. But I think
Yeah.
I think I mean it's right like because what I was saying earlier, we're visual creatures. If something doesn't seem to have truth to it visually, we're very quick to catch that. Whereas we don't think about what we're hearing. It just gets in and is immediately accepted as true.
Yeah, I think there's something about sound that also it tells you about a thing from a very different perspective than visual.
That's definitely true.
Is there anything particular? Because I'm ready to move to start working on the next panel. Is there any particular you want to note?
I just want to thank everybody for joining me. I mean, I feel like we could talk for like 2 more hours at least, and have like 3 times as many people in this panel. But
can we give everyone the opportunity to pimp out stuff that they're doing?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
We always support pimping out.
Do you want to start, Liz?
Okay, I'll start. Well, so I'm not doing any. I guess like I'm doing sound effects for a game right now, but like the games that I've done, I did sound for music for Dysphoria, Crypt Worlds, a few tracks for the Mirror Moon EP OST. I'm doing a few things for like Frog Fractions too, with a bunch of other people. But I also have a game called Problematic, which I did the sound and music for,
Which is great.
A big part of the experience. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I've been spending about 2 years and have another year left being slave to this abstract trance experience called Sound Self. If people are interested in that, you can go to soundselfgame.com.
So my recent project's been Fract OSC, which has kind of been absorbing all of my time recently. So yeah, you should check it out. It's at fractgame.com.
And I think I already mentioned the games I worked on: Analog, A Hate Story, Hate Plus, Depression Quest, Red Shirt, and currently working on another game by Christine Love called Lady Killer in a Bind. That also has a much longer title that I don't remember, but that won't be out for a while yet. So don't really have anything else to pimp.
Okay, that's cool. Well, I mean, thank you all for watching, and thank all 4 of you for coming to talk with us. We really, really appreciate it. That was a really
Thank
great
you.
panel.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks a lot for inviting.
That's super cool. We're gonna have a panel next on racism in games. If you want to hear about that, I highly recommend that you check it out. If you are a mod or interested particularly in modding, you should probably contact me because I want as many mods as possible for that conversation. I want to make sure that one goes as smoothly as possible. So if you'd like to, let me know. And thank you, everyone. We're gonna be back in just a few minutes for our next panel. You're watching IndiE3 2014. We'll be right back.
Bye.
Hooray!
Bye.